Hi everyone and welcome to this last week of this online workshop. So I know that many of you have not completed the assignments from Module 3, so you'll have to catch up this week. So I know that time is running fast. As I've announced, I was not able to comment on your posts in the last few days because I was the leading teaching and interdisciplinary teaching and learning workshop. And at the same time, I'm also, like you, following an online workshop, which is an update for the school evaluation visits to be a program leader. So I have to do that update. And I also had learning engagement activities to do. So I have slept actually about 9 hours in the last 3 days trying to do everything. So now, starting tonight, so in about 12 hours, I'm going to be able to comment on what you did on Module 3. So now I'm here to present you Module 4. So to start Module 4, there are the module notes. Once again, I'm going to show them to you if you open it up. And if you go to the investigating question part, what you see is you'll have resources about how to build inquiry questions. So one of the approaches to teaching is to be able to teach using inquiry-based activities. But what calls for inquiry is a question. So in that part, we'll write questions for the inquiry section of the unit plan, which will be questions which are not related to the content. And then we'll think about questions that you would ask. Actually, it's mostly the same questions in which we add the content. And the answer to these questions will ask for an activity, and that would often be an inquiry-based activity, thus meeting the requirement to have inquiry in your class. And of course, you can ask questions all the time because we're reflective. We can have questions in the reflection part, which we will not address in this workshop. So here there are some examples. Everywhere can look at that. There is a template to try to think about what to consider, but mainly it might help you. If it does, good for you. But actually, I don't use these templates, and we ask different type of questions. And you'll see here that they ask for teacher questions and student questions. And perhaps that at this point in time, if this is the first time that you are teaching the unit, you might not be able to identify student questions. But what I will tell you is that when we'll try teaching it, there will be moments where the students will raise a hand or ask questions. And I often say, well, you have a really interesting questions. And then I just write it down in my unit plan afterward. So, because sometimes we think that the students know some things, and we understand that, for instance, the students are not able to represent functions, and they ask questions about the representation, and then we would be able to try to build an activity so that next time the students would no longer have like this difficulty. So that's something that we always do. So we know the difficulties, mainly, especially if we are experienced teachers, but also the students who experience difficulties might lead us to identify interesting questions. So there's always also a webinar that you can look at in order to try to identify questions. So going back to the first learning engagement activity about inquiry questions, I'm trying to simplify that. Actually, what I would suggest is to write directly the questions in your own unit plan that you may have started. If you didn't start the unit plan, you have to copy paste everything in the last learning engagement activity from Module 4. So you can do it right away. Anyhow, I want to look at it. So you can download the template or not, because I give you the opportunity here to also use the unit planner in order to answer it. So you can either complete the template or you can fill the parts relating to the inquiry questions in the unit plan. And you can attach the unit plan using the advanced button. I recall that when you reply, there is a button here which is advanced, and when we click on it, it gives us the opportunity to upload a file, either by drag and dropping the files or by browsing through the drive in order to find your unit plan. So I've did copy that, so I'm going to go directly to my downloaded unit plan, and here in the first part, in the inquiry questions part, we have to identify questions: factual question, conceptual question, and debatable question. And the requirement is to have at least one question for each category. So the subject content is not included, so we're focusing it on the statement of inquiry. And the statement of inquiry, I recall, is we created the statement of inquiry combining the concepts, key concepts, related concepts, and the global context exploration. So here, basically, we would ask questions about the concepts and the global context exploration. So the question words would mostly be when, what, who for the factual question. When we'll ask questions starting by how or why, we would be in conceptual questions, and debatable everything else which leads to a debate. What I can tell you is that often people think that if we're asking a question about the concept, it's a conceptual question. But in this part, that's not the meaning of what we need to do. We could ask a factual question about the concept, like how do you define a relationship, for instance? And if we would add the mathematical perspective to that question, we could ask how can we define a relationship, but we can state the type, an exponential relationship or proportional relationship. So we can add the content in it, but we will not write the content here, because in the first part, either that be for the statement of inquiry or the inquiry questions, we want the other teachers from the other subjects to perhaps have the exact same questions. So the science teacher might have the exact same question. The economics teacher might have the exact same question, or in another subject. But so it will perhaps give ideas to build interdisciplinary projects or to activities. So that's why we try to keep it really general in that part. But the questions that you will ask, including in the mathematics, will be written in the action section of the unit plan. And that what it is, so let's say I would have for the content exponential functions, perhaps I would have here a question. So how do you define, for instance, an exponential function? But I could say, how could you represent, if I want to use the concept representation, an exponential function? So that would be a question with the content in it, as you might see. And underneath, I could say what activity I will do in order for the students to understand that, how to represent the functions. So what will I do? What teaching strategies will I use? How will I verify if the students have understood actually like how to present the functions? So how will I verify that? So these would be the formative assessment strategies. And actually completing all of these box, if I may say, is the learning activity number 4. So, and for differentiation, we can see that we have 3 ways of differentiation the tasks, either by differentiating the content, the process, or the product. So it might not be all 3. So right here, we understand that the inquiry questions are important and that they are leading the learning. And then we will take into consideration the formative assessment and the differentiation in order to complete the action section. So that's one part that has to be done, and it follows chronologically in that part. So in what sequence of teaching and learning that we will present the subject to your students. So this is what we have to do. Whereas here, if I go back in the conceptual question, how can we represent a relationship? And I could have used the word relationship actually underneath in the action section. An exponential, instead of saying functions, I could have say relationship, even though it's the same thing. So I'm going back to here, to my activity. The idea, and actually, as I've said, if students have interesting questions, we write it down. Questions that the students always ask, for instance, and questions that we want to address in order to teach our content. If you are using, so here are the 2 types of questions. If you are using the template, then try to just say for that topic, what are the questions that I would say? And for these concepts or for that global context, these are the questions that I would ask. But then you will have to associate these questions in the right box of the unit plan. In the second learning engagement activity, which is really important as well, we will add the approaches to learning activities. So we have in the MYP from principles into practice a lot of skills. And if I click on my post, I'll have it. Actually, if I use it here, I'm going to download it again. It is close to the end. Right here on page 107, which is SARS, and then 108, we have here the skill category, the skill clusters, and then the skills indicators, so which are much more specific. So we'll use these ones. Actually, we want to think about what approaches to learning that we will teach in our unit plan. So if I take the category communication, there are some that are especially really related to mathematics, as understanding and using mathematical notations. So of course, these are things that we'll have to plan from year 1 to year 5 in our sequence of teaching and learning. But the idea here is not to be using mathematical notations, is to be teaching something different. So whichever you choose as a skill indicator, you want to make sure that you have activities in order to teach the skills, that skill to your students. So if we would have the skill indicator organize and depict information logically, which is also related to our criterion C, then we would think about an activity which will allow the students to become better at doing that. Okay, so that's the main point. So here, once again, there is a template, which is pretty simple, or you can go in your unit plan. There is a section which is approaches to learning, and here underneath I say you how you can write like the sentence. So you have to identify the skill category, the skill cluster. Remind, category is here like social skills, and then the skill clusters, and I'll have a second video in a few seconds, the skill indicator. I'm going on in the second video in a moment.